that we've saved from Photoshop. So I'll save this out as a JPEG. And I'll call this chest diffuse GW001. And I'm just going to save it out as a maximum quality JPEG. It's always served me well. I've never needed to use any other type of texture. And actually, sorry, before I go in and do this, what I'll do is on the unincluded, just put that down to 4 like I'd had it previously set to. And now I'll duplicate this down the bottom and I'll just start calling this chest material. And then make the adjustment here. So I'll load the texture in on the duplicated mesh. And we can just load this in. And I'm going to put the blur amount to 0.05. The whole reason there's this blur amount inside 3ds Max is to, and I have explained this in previous lessons, is to make the sampling easier on the anti-aliasing engine. So when you blur the texture, the variation from pixel to pixel isn't as great, and you just sometimes make things a bit easier. But with that being said, for a print project, we want to make sure that everything is very crisp and very high detail. And if there's ever going to be any softening done to the image, you want to do that in post work. Print work is less about trying to make things easier on the render engine and more about trying to maximize the amount of details you have at your fingertips when retouching. So I'm not going to go all the way down to 0.001. I'm just going to go down to 0.05 and we can work with that. It should be low enough. And I'm also in the unincluded map slot. I'm going to put this to shaded in viewport. And now I'm going to go into the chest material here. And I'm going to assign this shader. And if I just go to a perspective viewport, now you can see that our diffuse part is loaded. And we've got our base to start working with. So what's going to be involved in actually constructing the shader for this guy? Now you can see here within this piece, there's a couple of different areas that require different shaders, like the rubber, for example. However, I'm not going to worry about that at this stage. I'm just going to try and get the whole shader looking nice as a metallic surface with all the detail. So the things we're going to need is we're going to need a reflection map. Even though we've got a fall-off map in the reflection glossiness, we're going to need to turn this to a composite map and overlay some grunge detail to blend through. And we're going to need a bump map. On top of that, when you have a surface like metal, especially worn down metal with a superhero character who's obviously going to be utilizing the suit to its extreme, you're going to be getting a lot of scratches and a lot of wear and tear in the areas which are going to be more prone to touching up against each other, like what we're seeing here in the diffuse slot. So the wider areas are the areas where we want to blend in a totally different shader. So at this point, I'm not going to worry about making it a multi-layered shader. I'm just going to get the base textures loaded in and created in Photoshop, and then I'll go in and explain how to set up the grungy material in the scratched areas, and also we're going to add in a little bump map a bit later. But for now, I need to create the reflection map itself. So we'll go back into Photoshop and start making that map. So with this base layer, the base texture, for the diffuse, the first thing I want to do is just go in and quickly group the base layer, and I'm just going to call that diffuse, which gives us a area we can go back to so we know that even with all the work we're about to do on top of this layer, we can disable all of the stuff above this new layer and just turn on all these layers to get back to our original diffuse map. On top of this layer, what I'm going to do is add a hue and saturation, and I'm just going to desaturate the image. because I don't want the color showing up in Photoshop. I just want a more true representation of what's happening with the reflection map. So remember, this is only for the reflection map. Now we don't want everywhere to be highly reflective. However, near the exposed areas, that's where I want things to be a little bit more reflective, so that we're adding a bit more highlights on the areas that are more exposed. So I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer over the top here. And the best part about this workflow is that from piece to piece, you pretty much get away with copying these layers in order to create the other maps. So the first thing I'm going to do for the reflection map is just slide the left side of the map up, because we don't want the reflection to be so dark. Like, it is a metallic surface, so even in the grungy areas we are still getting a little bit of reflection, and we don't want to completely eliminate the reflection in the grunged areas. We still do want it to be fairly reflective. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to slide the middle point I've created here over to the left. And one of the problems you can see when doing that is that Photoshop is quite sensitive, and we're actually blowing out all the areas above this white value to complete white. So if I zoom in here, we're losing a little bit of reflection detail in those areas. And what you have to do to counter that is create sometimes a couple of different points, and that's just going to prevent those areas from blowing out. So now you can see the difference. If you look here on the corners, as I change that, you can see what's happening. So I'm just getting back a bit of that detail. Now on this map, what you're also seeing here is a brightening effect of the smudges from the fingerprints. So you can, if I zoom in on this layer here, you can see the thumbprints are actually making things brighter. Now, based on everything I've told you so far, especially in lessons 4, when you have the fingerprints, you need the darker version of that to smudge over the top. So once I start working with this reflection layer, I'm going to turn off the fingerprints so you can see they're disabled now. I'm going to go into my source textures file, and you can see I've got the darker version of the thumbprints here, and I'm going to drag those over the top, and they're going to go to the very top of the image. So if I just go back and forth, you can see now that I've got an inverse version of that same texture map. So I'm going to turn off the bright versions, and now I'm going to multiply in the thumbprints, effectively making those areas of the map less reflective. I'm just going to drop the amount of effect that's going to have to 70%. Remember, I'm just eyeballing that. I just don't want it to be completely dark. Now from here, I've got a couple of different choices. I can either go in and add more grunge to the texture. So I'm going to drag over this grunge map, and I'm going to multiply that. And I'm just going to play with how low I go on this. If I have it set to 5%, it's a very small amount, but what we're doing is once again introducing a little bit more variation in the texture and nullifying that banding happening in the base two layers, in the cavity map and the occlusion map. So without any hand painting at this point, without doing any kind of complex texture setup, we've got a very detailed texture to work from here. Now I'm just going to go in and make a couple of adjustments to the curves here. Because I'm just trying to get the overall reflectivity a little bit higher. If you notice in the 3D file, the reflection's set to about 180. So when I go in and sample values here, I want to get a value similar to that. And you can see here it's set to 226. It's just a little bit brighter. Some areas go down though. So I can go to the curve adjustment here, and I'm just going to make sure that those areas aren't blowing out. And now we've got something that's a little bit nicer, a little bit more balanced. And there we go. I'm just going to save this out and test this on the material. To make things quicker when saving, I'm going to save the Photoshop file itself to the textures directory. What that does is it tells Photoshop to automatically open up that project directory when saving out any other type of maps. So I'm just going to call this chest diffuse 001. And now when I go to save the JPEG out, I can just click on the diffuse and change it from diffuse to reflection. On this slot, I'm going to load up the preview. And we're going to load the texture we've just saved out there. Now you can see in the reflection slot, we've just darkened off some areas. Once again, I'm going to go to 0.05 here in the blur amount. So now we've got a diffuse layer, a reflection layer, and I'm going to test how this looks. So I'm going to go back to the V-Ray camera, zoom in on the chest area a little bit more. And now that like I was saying earlier, when you've got a high-res texture enabled on the surface, you're going to need more anti-aliasing samples to clean it up. So in the color threshold, I'm just going to go down to 0.008, effectively making V-Ray use more of the max anti-aliasing subdivisions. Because we've got divide shading subdivs turned off, we're not affecting any of the scene samples, so we know that it gets much easier. And that's why from this point on I will stick to using divide shading subdivs turned off. It's just auto-saving the file. And I'll start the project up once it's finished rendering. So immediately, just with the diffuse map and the reflection map, you can start to see how some of the detail from the mesh begins to pop out a bit more. You'll notice that the diffuse brightness is basically the same as the non-textured variant. It's a little bit darker actually. But what having the edges brighter in the diffuse part is, and if I just go to the diffuse filter here, even though later on we're going to blend these areas with a scratch map, you're left with a tiny little bit of remnant area around the scratch, which just aids in popping out the detail from the mesh onto, it just makes things much more easy to determine where the edges on a surface actually are. So you can see the difference down here, we're not getting much of that visibility on the edges, whereas here, if I go to the diffuse once again, you can see it down here, we're popping off the edges and we're getting a little bit more brightness. In terms of the reflection amount, it's fairly subtle. However, you will notice that there is areas that are much darker, but most, and like I've been saying throughout the entire course, most of the variation in reflection amount, or the perception of the variation in the amount of reflection, is going to come from the reflection glossiness map. So the next phase is going to be going into Photoshop and creating that. But before I do, you can just see here that even though we do have a lot of reflection happening, a lot of anti-aliasing happening, we still haven't fully cleaned the reflection. So if I go to the reflection slot, you can see I just don't have enough there. And if I go to the specular as well, we don't have enough subdivisions in the settings. So I'm going to raise this to 10 in the reflection amount, and I'm going to bump the max subdivs up to 14. So in Photoshop, you can see we've created a curve adjustment layer to create the reflection. All I'm going to do here is duplicate this layer, disable the previous layer. I'm going to call this previous layer reflection curve, so that when I create other textured parts, I can copy this onto them, and I'm going to name this reflection glossiness curve. And for this particular piece, I want to make sure that it's important to realize that because we've got a curve already available on the reflection glossiness, what we're going to do here is we're going to go into the reflection glossiness and make this a composite map. And we're going to add a second layer, and I'm going to multiply over the top of that reflection glossiness curve this new texture we're about to create. So I'm going to go darker on the dark areas of the mesh and brighter on the bright areas of the mesh. And you can see here once again, I'm just trying to make sure that those things don't blow out too much. And the difference you can see there is the reflection map is a bit darker and more even, and the reflection glossiness map is brighter and it's got more contrast in it. And because those two layers over the top are completely separate, we aren't affecting how much they're being blended in. So I'm fairly happy with this map. I'm just going to save this out. Once again, as a JPEG, and we're just going to call this chest reflection glossiness, GW001. Now we're going to go back into 3ds Max and load that texture. And once again, we're going to set the blurriness to 0.05. So because we do have that being added on a separate layer, I can set this to multiply. And if I untick what you're seeing here, we're just multiplying down over that curved fall off. But the beauty of having this on a separate layer is we don't need to keep it at 100%. So we've got control here to kind of minimize or maximize the amount of effect that texture is having. So to start out with, I'll keep it at 100%, and if the material ends up being too blurry, I can reduce the effect of this map. So I'm just going to re-render again and see where we're at. So like I thought was going to happen, the material's become too blurred now, and we've lost that metallic feel of the surface. So I'm going to cancel the render. And in the multiply slot of this, I'm going to drop it down to 75%. And also in the base layer of the material, I'm just going to go in here and up the glossiness just a little bit. And now I'll re-render. And I'm a lot happier now with how things are looking. We've got a little bit more of that shininess back. One of the things to consider at this point though is that whether or not you're gauging how reflective your material is, when it's being rendered from an angle or the HDR is orientated in a way that doesn't ping enough highlights off the surface itself. So what I'll do is rotate the camera angle at this point to get a better feel for just how reflective the surface is, because remember, I'm just tweaking things at this point. I don't know exactly how reflective things need to be. I'm just trying to get it right on one piece so that later on when I go through the exact same process on the other parts, I know how reflective things are going to turn out. So I'll render things this time looking up, and hopefully we catch more of the reflection coming from the brighter areas of the HDR. If this doesn't work, what I'll do is I'll rotate the HDR, say 180 degrees, and do another test. But you can see already the angle I've rotated things at, we're picking up more highlights, and it's going to give us a better idea of how reflective and how grungy the surface actually appears. So I'll re-resume the recording once the render's done. So it's nearly there now, but it's still just a little bit too blurry. So there's a couple of options we have here. I can either go into the multiply opacity of this layer and reduce it, or I can go back into Photoshop and make a little modification to the map itself. And what I might do here is I might just brighten the more blurry parts up and effectively make the material look a little bit more specular. So if I just undo that, you can see just a little subtle change like that, and then just pulling this out a bit more makes that change there. And I'll resave this map over the top of the previous one. I'll make sure to go into the map once I've resaved that. I know if 3ds Max does auto reload things these days, but I'll just click the map anyway in the bitmap slot and just let it sort that out. And I'm going to re-render. So we're nearly there now. We are getting that nice crisp reflection on the edges, but I'm just going to make one small little change. I'm going to decrease this value here and just raise this up a bit on the reflection glossiness fall off, and I'm going to reduce the multiplier down to 70, and that should be enough. And I'm just going to change the angle once again to see how we're going here. Then from here I can start to create the bump map. So I'm finally happy with things. I've got the reflection behaving similar to the non-textured version, which is always the goal, but just to get things with that extra bit of detail in there. The purpose of narrowing down how reflective and how glossy something is so that you've got a rough idea of what is going to actually look metallic. And you could see up until this point it was a little bit too blurred. One of the problems is though is when you're working with a metal surface, unless you do have that subtle variation in bump in the high res, it looks closer to plastic. So now what we're going to do is we're going to alter the texture map in Photoshop to simulate the bump mapping. So if I go back to Photoshop now, you can see we've got things set up on the layer here. So we've got the diffuse grouped. What I'm going to do is group this second layer, and we're going to call this reflections, or actually I'll just call this reflection underscore adjustments, and just make that larger again. And I'm going to duplicate the two grunge, I'm going to duplicate the grunge map. I'm going to put that on a new layer, and I'm going to duplicate the grime we've got down the bottom here and put that on a new layer. And then I can turn off the reflection amount. What I'm going to do is steal one of the reflection curves I've got here, and we're going to call this bump adjustment. And you can see what I've done if I turn off these layers and turn back on the reflection adjustment. Because we've got certain things in the glossiness that we don't want to affect the bump, like the thumbprints, you have to remember that when you smudge something, all you're doing is adding a little bit of dust to that area. You're not actually denting the surface or bringing the surface out. So the bump mapping doesn't need to have those thumbprints. In fact, it looks worse when you do. So that's why I just delete the whole layer. We'll make this new adjustment layer so things are easy to understand when we go to make a new texture for each different piece. We're going to re-put that adjustment layer on, and I've kept a little bit of the contrast in there from the original, just so that we've got some of the stuff to work with. From here on the grime, I can add that layer, and then I'm going to make the grunge just a little bit more affected. And we end up with a layer like this. Now at this point, for the bump mapping, it is possible to go in, and if I find the source textures over here, you can see I've got a dust layer here. And you know, I can always go in and desaturate that layer, invert it, giving us a little bit more stuff to work with. And if I multiply this over the top, I can reduce that amount. And it's just giving us more detail being blended through. So for that layer, I'm just going to drop it down. I might actually go even lower, just to 10%. And you can see that we've got a nice bump map to work with now. And I'm just going to save this off. So once again, still zero hand painting. And this is just going to be called chest bump. That little thing that keeps coming up on the screen is just from my Wacom. I can't actually figure out how to disable that. It seems like every time they introduce a new tablet, more and more shit just gets slammed on the screen, like more and more settings you need to remove, so it's pretty frustrating. But we're going to go into the bump map now and load that new texture. And the bump mapping, I want the detail to be pretty much unpixelated or unblurred. So I'm going to go down to 0.01 for this particular map. You can see what that does is it takes away all of the blurriness on the map, leaving you with this really high contrast bump map. So you need to go in with the bump mapping and severely reduce the amount you're putting in. So even at 1, you'll see that things are extremely bumpy. If I just turn the bump mapping off, it has a big effect on everything. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to reduce the bump mapping to 0.5. So we've still got it there, but it's only going to be showing up in those really high res shots. So once again, I'll just render this and we'll see where we're at. So I've got this rendering, but the problem is the detail is too fine. I need more areas that are larger, like larger distortions. So what I'll do is I'll cancel the render and I'll take another look at what's happening in Photoshop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'm going to take out that dust layer I added over the top. And we'll see how this looks. So basically I've just softened off the bump mapping. Now I'm also going to go into the bump map itself, and on the filtering I'm going to put this up to 0.02 because I don't want that grainy appearance. I do want there to be a little bit more variation in the bump itself, not just this fine grain. And I'll just do a little region render. So I'm still not completely happy, and even though I've reduced the amount of bump by softening those layers and taking out the small dust, it's still got this very low, like tiny detailed bump appearing through the surface when I want a little bit more roughed bump. So I'm going to go into Photoshop now. I'm going to turn this top layer on to multiply. I'm just taking a look at it just to see if there's anything I can do. Alright, so I'll try and render from a different angle, see if that makes any difference. We are rendering where it's hitting bump at the highest point, and I might be being a little bit too picky because at this point we don't have any of the other scratches blended in. So what I'll do is I'm going to go down to the base layer here, and if you remember that original edge we added over the top, I'm going to duplicate this layer, bring it up to the top here. I'm going to turn off the original edge layer that's bumping things up, and I'm going to set this to multiply, and then I'm going to invert the layer. So now you can see I'm darkening off those bits. Just increasing the size a little bit because I've zoomed out. So now that I've changed the camera angle, things are definitely looking more like I expected them to in the highlight areas. It's just that when you don't have any kind of direct V-Ray lights in the scene, specular highlights and bump mapping might not always show up as well as it should. So that's why often I'll add in a second light into the scene, which is what I'm going to do now, just to enhance the direct specular highlight scene on the shader itself. So I'm going to come out here, go to this perspective viewport, and this is where I'll just go in to the V-Ray lights tab and add a spherical V-Ray light. Kind of putting it from above and just off 3/4. And I'll increase the intensity of this light and just give it some slight color. Now I'm going to render this from the perspective viewport just to see how much effect having a value of 255 is going to have on that. So the addition of that light is just helping bring out some of the surfaces. I'm actually going to go just a little bit brighter and drop it so it's a bit more in front. So I'll go up to 300 on the intensity. Okay, so at this point, what we need to do now is we need to go in and consider turning this into a V-Ray blend material so that I can create the scratch blend map to bring out all the little grungy details in the surface itself. So if we go in here, you can see what's bringing this surface to life is the scratch maps, and it makes the material look more used. And whenever you're trying to portray a material that's, you know, actually got some life to it, you need to consider the history of the material itself. Is this guy dealing with a lot of contact with other metal surfaces, or is he not getting hit at all? So you need to factor in that a character like Superman is meant to look like he's not damaged at all, and that's why he always kind of has this perfect appearance. Whereas someone like Iron Man, where it's more based on reality, when they're getting in contact and when they're having fights, you have to consider that he's obviously not able to clean or recreate the suit a million times over. So it's going to end up being completely worn down and destroyed in different parts of the surface. And we need to do that more in the areas that are open to being like in contact with other surfaces. So what I need to do is we need to make a blend map to blend in a scratch material. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to make the material itself. So I'm going to go into the main material here. We're going to turn this into a V-Ray blend material. I'm going to keep the old material enabled there. In the coat material, I'm going to make a new V-Ray material. I want to keep the diffuse component fairly bright on this. I'm going to add a fall off map. It's not essential. Technically, I can go up here and just make this highly reflective, unlock the Fresnel component and set this to 8, for example, making the material quite reflective. In the glossiness, I'm going to add a fall off map. And we're just going to modify the glossiness based on the angle here. And we're actually blending this through at 50% because of the texture in there, even though we're going to apply a map into this slot. So you can see it's quite reflective. The next thing I want to do is add some bump mapping to the surface. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to make a Burcon noise, and I'm just going to set the size down to 0.5. You can see that's adding tons there. So I might actually reduce the effect of that bump. I'm going to reduce the effect down to 5. And then I'm going to add some noise to the surface. Now also I need to go and make this have a GGX fall off. And actually I'm going to turn off Fresnel, and because this is a pure chrome material, I'm just going to go in and make a fall off map in the reflection slot. Because what I'm going to do is, and like I explained in the second lesson, I'm going to introduce that little curve that you see. Okay, so we've got two materials here. We've got the base material and we've got the coat material, but now we need to blend between them. So I'm going to go back into Photoshop here, and you can see our map for the bump mapping. What I'm going to do is I'm going to group these. Sorry, I need to select all of them. And this is going to be called bump adjustments. I'm going to duplicate that layer, turn off the old one. I can get rid of the grime here. And for the edges, you can see I've got those set to multiply, but I'm going to screen this over the top and invert it again. And I'm going to take off the bump adjustment, curve layer. So we're left with just the single texture. Sorry, I'm just zooming in. I'm just making sure that this is bright enough. And if it's not, what I can do is I can adjust this layer and pump it out more. But I'm going to leave it for now. But I'm also going to put a curve adjustment layer underneath and darken this off. Because remember, anything above black on this is going to be blending through that chrome. So now with the scratches map in the source textures PSD, I can shift drag this over the top. And like so, I've brought that in. But here's one problem. We only want these scratches to appear on the areas that are not being occluded. So what I need to do here is I need to drag the occlusion map from the bottom, duplicate that layer. I'm going to bring it all the way up to the top. And now you can see when I multiply the occlusion over the top of the scratches, it's darkening that effect in the areas where we don't want it. Now if I darken that even more, you can see I'm getting rid of it, and the only areas where there are scratches are where there's actual open edge, like open faces. So I'm going to just turn that into a layer and link that to the occlusion map with Control-Alt-G. You can see if I turn that off, hitting Control-Alt-G will only let that curve adjustment layer affect the maps linked to it underneath. If there's any areas on this map, on the scratches, you can see here where there's just too much, I can go in and simply erase it. But now on the scratches map itself, I'm going to add another curve adjustment and link it because I want to brighten the effect of this map blending through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this map off. And I'm going to call it Chest Blend. Now in the Blender Mount map on the file, I can go in and load that texture. I'm going to reduce it to 0.05 once again, and if I preview this map now, you can see that it's being blended everywhere except the bits that are being occluded. So we're not getting that map showing up in the cracks here, which really enhances the realism of the material. Now also, because all the UV islands are orientated differently, and each time you apply this texture over your different pieces, you're not going to notice any of that tiling once again because everything is in such a random orientation that you get this real natural effect. You can see on the material preview that there's that nice metallic sheen coming through now on those grazed areas. And what I can do is I can copy the blend map here, and in the bump mapping I can turn this into a composite map, add a new layer, and paste this over the top. So remember, we want these areas where there's scratches to be inverted. So what I can do is I can go into the actual texture here, and in the output I can invert it. And you can see what that's done. It's just flipping the texture. So now when I go out, if I multiply this, I'm multiplying this grunge over the top of the Burcon. And I just want to double check something here. I'm going to flatten this in Photoshop and just save out an inverted version just to make sure there's not something weird going on with the output. I'm going to call this chest blend bump. So it's just something I'm testing here. Okay, so it is just the preview bugging out a little bit. So I can delete this layer. And now we can test out how this looks. So the render's finished, but the scratches aren't coming through enough, and that's because the blend material isn't contrasty enough, and it's not blending through as pure white. So what I need to do is I need to go back into Photoshop, and I've just gone in and recreated that scratch layer. So you can see, let me just bring these two over, and I've just made it a little bit brighter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this in, and I'm just going to undo what I'd previously had set up, bring in the scratch layer here. Now I'm going to go back to the original occlusion map and add some contrast in it so that it's not darkening off the more open areas of the mesh. So we've got our occlusion here. I'm going to add an exposure layer to it and just brighten things up. And now I'm going to collapse this exposure down and make the image 8-bit. And now what I can do is I can bring this map in, set it to multiply, and link it to the scratches. And this may be adding too many scratches, but I always like to just test it. So I'm just going to save this new JPEG off. And sorry, I forgot to include in this map. Let me just go back. I forgot to include the specular layer. going to change the angle here. So now you can see there's quite a lot of scratches visible. I might need to mask off that because there just could be too much. But I'll render it off and see how it looks. So things are looking a lot better now. You can see in the areas where the highlights are pinging off, those scratches really do blow out. And whereas before, when the diffuse area was white here and there was no added reflection, now we're actually blending in a completely different chrome material to those parts so that the exposed areas are more reflective and they do have that grinded down appearance. If I go to the diffuse map, you'll remember I was saying that using this as a blend map leaves behind a little bit of a white edge, but these darker areas here are what's the chrome, and we're seeing a few pixels on the outside of that that are the original diffuse texture that just help bring out the brightness of those edges. You can see it there. I know it's extremely subtle, but it does make a difference when you're rendering things really high res. So there's a couple of different options we have at this point. I can look at this and either manually paint away where I don't want all these scratches. For example, there's just tons around this area. So I'll cancel this render, and inside the Photoshop file, what I can do is I can, for the scratch map, you can see that's coming over here. I can make a mask for that, and this is where I might do a little bit of hand painting. So I can just take a grunge texture and make it fairly big, and just paint away parts that I don't want. Which, to some extent, you are going to need to go in if you really want to refine the piece and make sure everything's working as good as it can. You will need to go in and do a little bit of that. So what I'll do now is I'll just show you. I've just got the tablet out, and I can just kind of paint away the areas where I don't want this texture being blended in. And it's usually going to be more in the, the soft areas in the center. I'm not brushing away near the edges. I'm just doing it quickly. I don't like to spend tons of time doing this. And you might not even need to do this depending on the piece, but seeing as this is a pretty central piece to the character, I've just gone in and I'll just spend a couple of minutes removing bits away. Another option is I can go into the occlusion map I generated earlier, and I can adjust that so that it's a little darker, but also so that it's not going completely white like I had before. So I'm just going to brighten this just up a little bit more than I had, and then darken it down. You can see it gets a little bit sensitive. And I'm going to collapse this. So now I'm actually darkening off some areas of the texture we're painting through here. And I'm just going to save this out. We'll just see that update. I'm just going to call this scratch. I'll just darken it off a little bit. And I'm going to reduce the subdivisions on this material because it is being blended in such a small area. The blend map itself is going to update. And also in the bump map, we're going to see that update as well. So once again, I'm going to re-render this off, and that's pretty much how I constructed every single material on the surface. But there are a couple of little modifications you can make. So for example, the areas that I want to look more chrome-like these intercostals here, I can go to the elements, and what I'll do is I'm going to select these two. It just gets a little bit slow. I can detach them as an entirely new object, just to save on time selecting these later on. And now I can duplicate this whole material, and I can call this chest material chrome. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the base layer here, and rather than use a Fresnel IOR of 2, I'm going to bump this up to 8, effectively increasing the reflection just on this material. Now when I assign that material, it's everything is behaving the exact same, except it's going to be a lot more reflective. And I'll just render this off. So there you go, that's basically how the final material is set up in the scene, and you can see for yourself when you take a look at the scene files. It's very simple, there's just the 2 layers, there's no more requirement for adding those multiple layers anymore, because GGX does such a nice job of getting that, metallic fall off happening. Now for the stomach area here, this was also meant to be a rubber material. So when I spoke to Raf, he was telling me that it looked all the same. So I needed to go in and make another adjustment to get this looking like rubber. And obviously rubber doesn't have the scratch layer on it. So all I did for the rubber is I duplicated the material for the base. Now so you can see when I do that, we lose that rubber appearance. What I did is from here is I changed the reflective IOR to 1.6. I've kept the diffuse the same, and in the reflection glossiness slot, I've severely reduced the amount of effect that's going to have. Now the problem is when I don't overlay that detail onto the rubber, things become too bright. As you can see, the difference is night and day. So I need to go into the base fall off material here and drop this down, because the rubber's not going to be as shiny. So you can see as I drop that down, it becomes a little bit more like rubber. Now also in the bump mapping, I'm going to go in here. Sorry, I might have just gone a little bit too quick. In the bump mapping, I'm going to keep it the same, but I'm going to add some blurriness to it. So I'm going to go to 0.2. I don't want it to have such a sharp, crunchy bump. In the reflection, I'll leave that the same for now, but once again, I'm just going to increase the blurriness to 0.2 to soften that off. Depending on how bright this turns out, I might need to put a color adjustment curve on the diffuse component to make it brighter, but we'll see in a second. So as usual, I'm going to go in and select the render element and detach this piece. And actually, you know what? I can just kind of tell already that I'm going to need to add a color curve to this map. So in the diffuse part, I'm just going to make things a bit brighter. And you can see already that gives it a bit more of a rubber appearance. Okay, time to test that. So on the rubber, I think it looks just a little bit too reflective and shiny at the moment. So I'm going to cancel it. And in the reflection glossiness, I'm going to increase the multiply factor here and then just go down and just drop a couple of these settings to make it a bit more blurry. And I'll render again. Straight away you can see that blurring the reflections give the appearance a brighter look. So to counter that, I'm going to darken off the diffuse. So as you can see with that rendered, now this front material looks a lot more like rubber and breaks apart the continuity of that constant metal kind of scratch material. So like I was saying, because every single piece is textured the exact same, and up until this point in the lesson, there isn't any repetition from piece to piece. All I did to finish this project, and you can see if I go to the beauty render here, the texturing on the chest is the exact same as on the legs. You can still see the scratch maps coming through. On the areas like this thigh pad here, I've done the same thing I did for the intercostals and the chest. I've increased the Fresnel IOR to be 8 so that the material looks more like chrome. But the detail on the mesh itself is what's defining how reflective and how grungy that surface is. So on the chest here, we're only getting that chrome blending through in the exposed areas. So like on this piece, I'm blending in more of the chrome on those areas and then less on the areas where it's kind of crunched in. And the model's detail itself ends up defining how the object looks. And you get that real kind of nice appearance. So you can see that the bicep here is textured the exact same as the thigh pad, and the material looks the same, but because the bicep doesn't have all those little grid lines in it, it just changes the way it looks. But there's still the areas where there's grunge and things like that. On the arms, for example, once again, you're seeing that chrome appear on the edges, just like on the chest piece. And the same for the shoulder pads, except on the shoulder pads, I'm not increasing the Fresnel IOR to 8. I'm keeping that as 2. So it's got the same appearance as the arms, but with that crosshatch geometry detail inside. So as I go to the final file, I will show you what the different textures look like on the whole surface, just so you can see. But obviously I can't spend 10 hours on the lesson, so I've had to show you the workflow for one piece, but I guarantee you 100,000% that it was done the exact same for every single piece. The only minor differences are on that some pieces, like the shoes and the arms, I've gone in and added an extra layer into the diffuse material, which was a dusty layer. And I've blended that in with the dirt map, which I will show you. You can see on the hands here, I've also blended in this kind of heated metal look that, you know, when you heat iron up, like you're forging it, I've blended in that type of shader. So I will show you how to do that. But what we're going to do now is we're going to cut forward to the scene with everything shaded and textured apart from the lighting being added, and I'll run you through how I've built the more specific parts of the scene. We are at the 2 hours and 15 minutes mark now though, and I wanted to keep the finale under 4 hours, so I might need to shorten some little things here and there.